but we had to find some wolves. So I worked with Christina Williams, who is pictured here at the Wolf Hollow Wolf Sanctuary in Massachusetts. And there was a beautiful population of wolves there. They had all been raised by Christina, and she worked tirelessly to help me test the wolves that had been raised as puppies by people. So they were very comfortable with people. They enjoyed interacting with Christina in particular. And she did the testing of the wolves so that they would be comfortable being tested. But it ends up that they didn't use the human social cues that she gave them. In fact, here's the data where the gray bars represent the wolves. We gave them 36 repetitions of the pointing game. We did different versions of it where we actually even tapped on the location, tap, 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 and pointed to where the food was hidden. And you see that they're really just at about 50% there, whereas the same number of dogs, we looked at 7 wolves and 7 dogs, and the 7 dogs were above chance with all 3 of the cues, and both species were below chance when there was no cue provided. So they weren't using their noses, and only dogs were using the social cues. So we didn't find any evidence, at least in this case, that wolves were flexibly using human social gestures in a way that we were seeing in dogs. Their performance was reminiscent of what we see in great apes. And even with a lot of repetition, 36 trials is a lot of repetition, they were not showing improvement. And that suggested to us that really there was something different between the 2 species. Now, we did do one other control, because you could say, well, the wolves, maybe they're just not good at any of these kinds of games. They're wolves. They want to run around and, do wolf things, not play your human games. We did play other games. For instance, we played a memory game. And in that memory game, where all they had to do was remember where food was, and Christina would hide it in one of her 2 hands, and then they had to remember which hand it was in. That was easy for them, and they actually did as well as the dogs in that game. So it's not that they couldn't play games with Christina that were required memory and cognition, obviously, a type of cognition. It really seemed that it was specific to this social gesture where they struggled. So that then led us to say, well, we couldn't find any evidence for the exposure hypothesis. We didn't find any evidence on this first attempt to look at this, of this ancestry hypothesis. That made us then think about the domestication hypothesis. What if, since dogs split from wolves, there's been some kind of evolution, that dogs have actually changed and they have evolved to read human social gestures in a way that other species can't? Oh my goodness, that would be really exciting if that was the case. And we got really interested in thinking about that idea. And of course, the reason that would be exciting is because these are the same skills that we are interested in trying to understand how they evolved in humans. Given that we haven't seen that great apes use gestures the way that we do, but dogs seem more similar to us. So if we could see how this happened in dogs, and if it really was the case that dogs had evolved these skills during domestication, well, we'd understand ourselves better. So, but at the same time, anytime there's a hypothesis that seems that exciting, you have to be extra careful. And the real issue with the hypothesis was, how are we going to test it? Because how are we going to test whether dogs, during domestication had been selected, and actually the dogs that had some allele, and that there was a change in allele frequency over time that allowed dogs to somehow pass a heritable skill in reading human gestures that allowed those dogs to be better able to survive and reproduce? How in the world were we going to look at that? We didn't, without having to start all over again and domesticate a population of wolves. So this is another great point to realize what science is and isn't. And science isn't just having an idea that you can't test. To do science, your idea has to be testable. Well, thankfully for this guy, we could test the hypothesis about the domestication of dogs, and the potential that the real genius of dogs was that during domestication they somehow had gotten better at understanding humans, and as a result they could use us as tools and solve all sorts of problems that other species couldn't. And the reason this fox is going to be so instructive is because there's a population of foxes that had been experimentally domesticated over a 50-year period, and that will be what the next lecture is about, is the story of traveling to Siberia and trying to test the domestication hypothesis. So in summary, in trying to understand the origin of dog social cognition, there are really three hypotheses that have been suggested to explain the remarkable communication found in dogs: the exposure hypothesis, the ancestry hypothesis, and the domestication hypothesis. The use of gestures didn't seem to be explained by the high level of exposures to humans throughout life. When we looked at puppies, wolves look really similar to great apes in using human gestures. Dogs really seem to be the odd man out. The domestication hypothesis seems plausible but difficult to test, and if we can't test it, well, we were stuck. So that's what the next lecture will be about, is how can we actually test the domestication hypothesis.